Almighty and everlasting God, you are always more ready to hear than we to pray, and to give more than we either desire or deserve. Pour down upon us the abundance of your mercy, forgiving us those things which our conscience is afraid, and giving us those good things for which we are not worthy to ask, except through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ our Savior, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen. Amen. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Daniel, and I lead music at IAC, but I also do some behind-the-scenes things like tech and some comm things. My interest in the topic, the soul shame, this book, actually started by accident. I was in a big reading phase before I had my first child, reading a ton of books, and a mentor to me who lives on the East Coast, he's a pastor at an Anglican church over there, he accidentally recommended this book to me. He thought I was looking for a book recommendation, and I wasn't. And he sent me this book, and to be honest, my first impression of the title was that I really wasn't interested. It seemed like something that a lot of people thought was a problem, shame, and a lot of Christians thought was a big problem, but I didn't feel like it was as big of a problem for me or really for anyone else. And in fact, as a worship leader, I was sensing that it seemed to be such a self-centered focus. And I knew a lot of worship songs felt this way to me. I think of examples, and these are, this is a great song. I highly recommend the song. But songs like "I Am Who You Say I Am," and it just felt so self-centered. It felt so turned inward. So that was my first reaction, except that the person that recommended it to me, I highly respected, and he said it was life-changing, which was a big deal. So I did read it, and then I read it again, and then for this class I read it a third time, and it has been life-changing for me. I had no idea how big of a role that shame played behind the scenes in my own life and in the lives of others in my relationships. A little bit about Curt Thompson. He is a board-certified psychiatrist. He's the author of Anatomy of the Soul, founder of the Center for Being Known. That's a nonprofit organization that trains leaders on the intersection between neurobiology and Christian spiritual formation, which is something I'm actually really interested in. There are other books I've read along those lines, Desiring the Kingdom, and then a non-Christian book, Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. I felt like we're kind of crossovers, at least from the neurology or neuroscience standpoint. A little overview of the three classes, though. We're going to start this class one with an intro, kind of overview of where we're going. We're going to talk about how the mind works, and we're going to talk about how shame specifically works on the mind through the lens of neuroscience. I will say that for most people that read this book that I've talked to, and for people that I've talked to about this book, this is the least exciting for most people. So if you're finding yourself toward the end of this class like, oh gosh, that's heavy, hang in there. I promise it gets better, but this sets a really good context and will help us to embody or see how shame is embodied, or how shame works in the body, which is really important. Class two, we're going to talk about what that means for our own shame narratives, and how shame is seen in the biblical narrative as well. And then class three, we'll talk about the solution to shame. So this kind of, if you follow the book, we're going to kind of go through intro through chapter 3, and then class 2, chapter 4 to 5, and class 3, we're going to go chapter 6 to 9. So if you do have it, you don't have to read the book to follow along with class at all. It's a very technical read. I was just talking with somebody, I forget who it was, Sandy Ravine. I was just talking with Sandy about how heavy this book can be, how heady it is. So it'd be kind of a difficult read, and which is one of the reasons I was kind of inspired to do this class directly from the book, because I think it's such a good book. It's just difficult, and I think a lot of people may not pick it up, or if they do, they don't pick it up for very long. Any initial questions or thoughts before I jump in? And we will unmute you just briefly for that, if I can. Let's see if I can. Actually, you should be able to unmute yourself. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. I don't see any. Going once, going twice. All right. Well, I'm going to jump in. First of all, one of the biggest sort of themes and ideas that we're coming to understand is that we are storytelling creatures. Unlike any other creature in all of creation, we, as our brain develops, we tell stories and we live out of stories. Everything that we do and feel and sense has a story behind it. And we are telling stories all the time through everything that we are doing and feeling and sensing. Stories that we're aware of and stories that we're not aware of. 3 features of our stories from Curt Thompson. Did I actually share? Oh, yes, I did. 3 features of our stories. Number 1, we are not the sole authors of our stories. Our stories begin before we're even born. There were parents or caretakers that had hopes and dreams and fears, and their story absolutely played a role in the way that our brain developed from the very beginning. So our stories, we're not the sole authors of our stories. Second feature of our stories is that most of our storytelling doesn't involve language. And this is one of the biggest things we'll talk about over and over and over again. Inwardly, we are telling stories in our mind through senses, through imaging, and through these gut feelings that we have. And outwardly, we tell stories even through tone and nonverbals and subtle hints, saying, "I'm sorry," versus "I'm sorry." It's totally different stories. We don't tell, and this is the third feature of our stories, we don't tell our stories into thin air. We desperately want our stories to be heard and validated. There's a saying that Curt Thompson has: every newborn child comes into the world looking for someone looking for them, and that longing never stops. So the question becomes, what story do we believe that we're living? We long to live in a story of goodness and hope and joy and beauty. And many of us, assuming most of us are Christians, we want to believe that we're living the biblical story. But many times we find ourselves living as if we don't really believe that story. For example, when I was at InterVarsity in college, a friend of mine said, "I want us to start a worship band for chapel services." The chapel services hadn't happened for 700 students. Now, I knew the biblical story. I knew that it says, "Do not be afraid, don't worry." I know the story, but I could not stop myself from feeling nervous and being nervous and hesitating and not wanting to do this thing. We find ourselves living through our desires and through our senses, living contrary to the biblical story over and over, even though we desperately want to live it. And what we're going to see throughout this class is at the heart of that conflict, we find shame. So let's dive into shame. This will be a brief overview of what we'll be going over through the whole book, but there are just some introductory things. First of all, Curt Thompson, he says the phenomenon of shame, it's a primary tool that evil leverages, out of which emerges everything that we call sin. As such, it is actively, intentionally at work both within and between individuals. Its goal is to disintegrate any and every system that it targets, be that one's personal story, a family, marriage, friendship, church, school, community, business, or political system. And its power lies in its subtlety and its silence. It will not be satisfied until all hell breaks loose, literally. So 3 features of shame. Number 1, it is an undercurrent of sensed emotion. It may not be what you typically think of. It's this thing that we feel, but it's not always the apparent emotion on the surface. It's this felt sense that I do not have what it takes to tolerate a particular moment or circumstance. So the sense that I'm not enough in some way, or I'm less than, a sense of lessening. And this, in its most apparent forms, we pretty commonly know it when we've experienced embarrassment or guilt. But it can also be the undercurrent with frustration and even grief. With grief, we expect to feel sadness, but there is often also this desperation that we don't have what it takes to tolerate this sadness. And I think a lot of us can relate with that, especially with loss. Shame prefers to work in the shadows as an undercurrent, and its power is primarily precognitive. So the weight of it is not in the way we're thinking, it's in this gut feeling that we have that we can't shake. Okay, so, and it happens to us before we ever have a chance to put words to it. It's just something that we sense. We don't often have the words for it at all. So it's precognitive. And and because of that, we can't combat it by simply changing the way that we think. When it came down time for me to actually lead worship at Retelling for the first time in front of 700 and something people for chapel, I had told lots of people how nervous I was, and I had heard all the things of what I should think and how I should feel, and how I shouldn't worry, and this is for God and not for people, and I know the biblical story. But I could not, and I felt like I'm going to do this, I'm okay, I'm taking the plunge, but there was nothing that I could do to physically stop my legs from shaking. Literally, I could not stop them from shaking. We can't simply change the way we think to combat shame. In fact, telling ourselves that we shouldn't feel the way we do often actually reinforces shame and makes it worse. Another key distinguishing feature of shame is condemnation and condescension. It's this sense that I should have done things this way, or I should have felt this way, or I should have been this. And it doesn't need to seem overly harsh to us. Reasonable judgments in our own mind often are just cloaked shame. But this condescension, it doesn't just happen within us, it ends up spilling outwards. There's a saying, shamed people shame people. And we were just talking about this, all the political comments and one-liners in social media and the circle of responses of feeling shamed. The point of most memes, for example, it's to make fun of something. I've got a meme I want you to look at. I thought it was a great example. I'm going to share it with you here in a second. Let me find it. And I just want you to think about, where is shame behind the person who posts this and behind the reactions to it. This is the meme. When you post a meme making fun of the political right and people start calling, I hope this is safe enough to share. People start calling you out to be a leftist when you're actually neither. So the point of most memes is to make fun of something. And in this, I love this example because it's one that's come after, later in this sort of cycle of shaming that happens with these one-liners. At some point, this person obviously posted a meme before, shaming people who were political right. And somehow, it seems clear, they responded in a way that drew out shame in this person, such that they respond again with another meme, another one-liner, another sort of blanket statement with this guy from, I forgot the movie all of a sudden, but anyway.
The Princess Bride.
Thank you very much. Obviously, making fun of the people that have done this to him in order for them to feel better about themselves. I'm going to stop that share real quick. So most memes, they're making fun of something. The felt intent behind them is that not only do I disagree, but I'm laughing at you. But here's the thing, I feel the need to laugh at you because if you were to be taken seriously, then that might mean something might be wrong with me, and I don't have what it takes to tolerate what that feels like. I'd rather live in a world where you are less than, where you are a joke, and I'm secure. And posting this meme without having a conversation with you, posting this and running away, is my way of telling that story, that narrative, and hiding behind it. Which brings me to the third distinguishing feature of shame, that it drives us to hide. I will never forget leading the doxology sometime last year. We had just started to do it a cappella again, and it had been a long time. And the thing about leading a song a cappella for a bunch of people is that you never really know what that first note is going to be when it comes out of your mouth, right? Unless you're like humming beforehand. But I was super nervous, and I had not practiced beforehand. And I ended up starting at the first service, the doxology, in a really high key. And I know this song, so I know that it's only getting higher as we sing it. And I'm thinking, oh no, am I going to be able to finish this song? And I'm experiencing just this sense that like everyone knows what I did, and I'm embarrassed, and I just know everyone sees this. And I remember just barely squeaking out the highest notes, thinking, oh, maybe I can laugh at this later, but right now this feels terrible. And so second service rolls around, and I'm so nervous. I'm thinking I have to start this in the right key. I've really got to do this. But I'm so nervous. Not only do I start it high, but I started even higher than I did for the first service. And I was mortified. And I remember my reaction, my instant, like, didn't even think about it reaction, is I started to turn away physically from everyone and face the cross and raise my hands, hiding behind this resemblance of a, sincere worshiping posture that was all me hiding because I just didn't want to be seen in that moment. Shame drives us to hide. And it's probably not hard for any of us to think of a secret, for example, that we would go to great lengths to keep, to hide. But we also hide in small ways every day without realizing it in our conversations and our interactions with people. But with every effort to hide something about ourselves that we don't like, shame tightens the noose. This is directly from The Soul of Shame. Curt Thompson says, the very act of turning away while temporarily protecting and relieving us of our feeling and the gaze of the other, ironically, simultaneously reinforces the very shame we are attempting to avoid. So again, the three features of shame, just briefly, that it is this undercurrent of sensed emotion, not always apparent. The sense that we don't have what it takes to tolerate something. And it presents itself as condescension and spills out as condescension, and it drives us to hide. The end goal of shame is disintegration. We're going to use this word a lot and explain it and dive into it a lot more. Disintegration of our minds, like literally, disintegration of our relationships, and ultimately of all of creation. And the goal of this book and this class is to learn how to recognize shame in our own bodies, in our own stories, attune to our shame as a part of a larger story, and then turn our attention toward the counterintuitive, very counterintuitive remedy for shame. We're going to start, and this is one of the more difficult parts, all right? So stay tuned, stay as connected as you can. We're going to dive into some of the science of the mind. The most boring line I'm about to say right now, so just make it through this line, make it through this definition that Curt Thompson has in The Soul of Shame of what the mind is, and you'll be fine. It is a fluid, emerging process that is both embodied and relational, whose task is to regulate the flow of energy and information. A fluid emerging process that is both embodied and relational, whose task is to regulate the flow of energy and information. Now, I'm going to break that down just a little bit. First of all, the mind is not some abstract thing. Like often we think of it as like our sort of essence or our spirit or something that just our thoughts somewhere out in space. But that it's not an abstract thing. There is a network of electrochemical reactions for everything that we sense, feel, think, or do. The mind is embodied. And the mind includes more than just the brain. We know that we're nervous because we're sweating or our legs are shaking. So it includes more than just our brain. The mind, again, or another feature of the mind, is that it's never at rest. Even when we sleep, the mind is giving us senses and emotion, and emotion is turning in our mind. Electrochemical between the neurons, electrochemical reactions are firing. Also, the mind is relational. Its development is deeply dependent on relationships, and depending on the relationships that we had growing up and the relationship that we have now, our mind is developing differently. And finally, there are several what's called domains of the mind, and the book dives deep into this, but we're I'm going to give you just the names of them. The different domains of the mind, and these are all theoretical domains, but there's consciousness. That's kind of something that makes sense to us, this thing that we know we're aware of ourselves, right? Self-awareness. There's a vertical dimension. There's a horizontal dimension. Memory is a domain of the mind, implicit and explicit memory. Narrative, interpersonal, temporal, and transpiration. There's all these domains of the mind, the way that the mind connects to itself, and different things do different parts of the mind do different things as we live our lives. And the health of the mind depends on their connection and integration, which happens primarily in the prefrontal cortex. And we'll get into disintegration a lot. And when we're talking about disintegration, we're talking about when these domains of the mind are not integrated in the prefrontal cortex. All right, we're going to skip a lot on the mind from there, but we're going to touch on a few other things. One very important thing is neuroplasticity. Now, really, I am always I'm drawn to the fact that it was really, truly just recently in the 90s that scientists discovered that the mind was far more capable of adapting and regenerating than previously thought. You know, they used to think your mind was done around between the ages of 12 and 16, and they discovered, whoa, that's not actually true. You may have heard the phrase, neurons that fire together wire together. It's called Hebb's axiom. Neurons that fire together wire together. This is the concept that the more our minds activate a connection between neurons, the easier it becomes for that same connection, that same pattern, to fire again in the future, and the more permanent that connection becomes. So in electrical terms, it's almost as if each time electricity travels from one neuron to another, the wire between the neurons, it gets thicker so that there's less resistance and more current flow. Or if you think of water traveling through a ditch, right, a really rugged ditch, over time, the water will smooth out that ditch, and more water will be able to flow, and it flows easier and faster. That's kind of what happens in the brain, literally. Every perception or feeling or action in our lives is connected to these networks of firing, these networks of neurons firing. And as we repeatedly experience the same perceptions over time, the emotional impressions, eventually the network of connections fire automatically with the slightest nudge, often by things we might think are completely unrelated. We're sometimes left wondering why we suddenly feel frustrated or depressed or excited, etc. But something inside of our mind or outside of us has triggered a network that was slowly built over time. So, another feature of all of this is that our attention is in the driver's seat. Our attention, what we are attuned to, drives all of this activity. But it's not as easy of a thing to control as you might think. Often we don't even realize what we're paying attention to. It takes practice. We could be thinking one thing, but our body is paying attention to something else. Curt Thompson says, ultimately, we become what we pay attention to. Most of what brings people into his office, he says, is a function of the degree to which they do not pay attention to much of what their mind is doing. Another feature of the mind is the primacy of emotion. Now, this doesn't mean emotion is most important, but most people, when they first think about the mind, they associate it with the process of how we think, like logical, linear thought. But logical, linear thought is one of the last things to develop in the mind. Emotion is actually the energy around which the brain actually organizes itself. And it's woven throughout every human activity, including linear thought. And in terms of neurobiology, there is never a time that we are not being emotional. So next time somebody tells you you're being emotional, Next time you feel like you're just being emotional, remember, there is never a time when we are not being emotional. For example, when we are remembering the past, or when we think about the future, anticipate the future, we first anticipate it or remember with our emotions. We see images in our mind, we image things, and at the same time, in that same instance, our bodies are emotionally anticipating how it felt or how it will feel, even despite facts that we know. Much of what we remember and how we remember can depend on how we feel in a given moment that we remember it. In the context that you're currently in can change all your memories of your past. But we feel the emotion first, and that happens before we can ever describe it factually with language, with words. A final feature of the mind or of the brain in particular is, that I just want to briefly touch on, is attachment. So you may have heard of attachment theory, very popular theory in psychology. It's this idea that from infancy, or it's the process of the immature brain of an infant learning how to organize and regulate itself through interacting with a more mature adult brain. So from infancy, the development of our brain is dependent on empathy, attunement, and mindfulness, and the proper setting of limits by another brain. There are things that we can't do, we can't use our brains in particular ways unless someone comes alongside us and helps train us how to use it. From there, we're going to talk about shame, but before we talk about shame in the brain, we really need to talk about joy in the brain. C.S. Lewis says in The Weight of Glory, glory for humans is hearing that we are pleasing to the one whose pleasure we most long to fulfill. No more realized than when we hear our master say, well done. Alan Shore is a prominent psychologist and researcher in the field of neuropsychology, and he says the most crucial task of an infant is the pursuit and acquisition and establishment of joyful, securely attached relationships. What this means is it's within the emotional safety of a securely attached relationship that the human mind experiences freedom to explore, discover, and create, which leads to joy. A child comes into the world looking for someone, looking for her, and her mind is working interdependently with another mind and in response to the apparent intentions of the adult. Not to the words that they say, but to what's apparent to them, to the child, the apparent intentions of the adult. And from the experience of being enjoyed by the adult, joy emerges from within their own mind. And that joy then reinforces anticipation that further interactions will be positive. So that when the child eventually experiences danger, pain, or relationship ruptures, even with the parent, like a child facing reasonable consequence for crossing a parent's boundary, facing a sort of temporary rupture in that relationship, those things are easily healed, and instead of stifling growth, they lead to further development of the mind. For infants, this joy is contingent on sensing the parent's emotional experience of them. They can't express it in language, but it's an impression given by the adult that I'm so glad to be with you. And to the degree that joy precedes and follows this growth, established and secure attachment of the adult, or to the adult, the mind thrives and experiences healthy integration of all those domains that we talked about. So that's joy. It's a different story with shame. Through the lens of neurobiology, shame is not bad in and of itself. It's really just our body's way of warning of potential abandonment. So it's a harbinger of abandonment or a herald of abandonment, letting us know, hey, you might be left alone here. Even though we don't always think of it that way. The problem with shame is that we tend, to respond to it by relationally moving away from others rather than towards them. This is the disintegration of relationship. And this is the mind's desperate attempt to reduce the stress of shame as quickly as possible, leading us to just run, to flee. And while we move away, interestingly, the various domains of the mind are also disintegrated. They stop connecting through the prefrontal cortex entirely, and they stop working together. We have our first experiences of shame at 15 to 18 months of age, before we ever have words to understand or describe what we're sensing. It happens when we're interrupted by a glance or a tone or voice or body language or gesture or some sort of intense behavior from somewhere else that gives us this subtle but undeniable felt message of disapproval. For a child, think of the brain having three different systems working together, okay? You have this one system that's driving them forward, full throttle, anticipating a positive outcome. You have another system that's responsible for slowing that down like a brake, cautioning them. It's just slowing them down. And you have a third system that acts kind of like a clutch, keeping the balance between the brake and the gas pedal, between the two, so that the mind doesn't just jolt back and forth. When we're young, the clutch, which is our prefrontal cortex, is extremely immature and has to be trained how to work. So like learning how to drive a stick shift on a car, it can be jolting. Because a toddler especially depends on an adult to teach the prefrontal cortex to be the clutch, you might have a situation like this. A parent sees a toddler racing forward toward the street, and a parent yells, "No!" Now the toddler has no idea in abstract terms what the word no actually means. The parent could yell any word to get the same response. The child is primarily responding and living out of the emotional right side of the brain, feeling their way through life. He or she will hear the sharp tone, which makes the child feel startled, feel minor discomfort, feel blushing. And then, if the parent is attuned to the child's emotional response, the parent will then follow up with a comforting tone, maybe saying, "Let's go this way," which reinforces the child's sense of connection. Again, the story changes completely when that connection is not reinforced. Let's say, for example, when Penny was 3 years old, she was singing and playing behind me in the kitchen while my 6-month-old Theo, when he was 6 months old, he was just laying in the bassinet. And let's say suddenly I hear behind me my son crying in pain. So I turn around and I see that Penny has a spoon and she's trying to scoop out my son's eyeball. And just imagine all the ways I can react, okay? And just for making a good example, we didn't react this way, but you could see how I might react this way. I didn't react this way. But let's say I grab Penny and I yell, "No, Penny, what do you think you're doing? How many times do I have to tell you, be gentle with Theo?" And that's it. No follow-up, no attunement. I then go to Theo and I comfort him and I ignore Penny. No attunement to what happens to Penny after that. There's this shearing interruption of the joyful anticipation in Penny's mind. She's just playing. She's just exploring the world with totally positive anticipation of what's to come. No clutch is applied to the brakes in her mind, and the mind is suddenly overwhelmed and unhinged. Thompson compares it to railway cars piling up behind the mind's engine. And this is where shame strikes. The physiological response might look like a lowering and turning away of our gaze, of the child's gaze, a heaviness in the chest, total brain fog, an inability to think, a wave of intensified blushing coursing over our body, a turning in towards ourselves and away from others. Cognition is disabled and words are hard to find. And thanks to neuroplasticity, the more this happens as we grow, the more easily our attention is drawn to these negative sensations, and the more permanently these neural networks of shame are embedded, making it even easier for them to fire later on with the slightest nudge, giving us sensations that drive our behavior without us even realizing that they're there. When I was in junior high, I was laughed at a lot. I was made fun of a lot. We had moved around a lot. I was very insecure, and this led to a lot of teasing and making fun. And to this day, when Janelle and I are having a conversation, and she laughs at something that is not a joke, laughs at my opinion, I feel this welling up of this, how dare you? Who do you think you are? This like, how could you possibly laugh at me when it's not even, a serious moment? I feel it welling up in me, especially if I'm ever in an argument with someone and I see them, even for a moment, smile. It's just the sense, and it's that same feeling I had being laughed at in school in junior high. A few different things that shame does. Shame has a disintegrating effect, like we talked about. When we experience shame, all of the 9 domains of the brain struggle to function and connect, and it feels impossible for us to focus our attention on anything except what we're feeling. And on a smaller scale, we've all experienced this when we can't remember someone's name when we see them, right? We know their name when we're not with them. As soon as we see them, we get a little bit of nerves, and suddenly cognition fails us. With shame, the prefrontal cortex struggles, and in severe cases, it goes offline. And the activity of the brainstem, that part of us that we share with animals, our primal nature, it overwhelms us, and emotion pours out of the right side of our brain. All of this combines with implicit memory. This is that under the radar emotional memory of all the other times we've had this feeling. And when we feel things, especially negative things, it's not that we're just feeling it in that moment, but we're feeling the weight of all the other times we've felt this before, and it's more overwhelming. We begin to construct a story with an unbearable ending. We feel intolerable and stuck in this feeling, and we feel isolated. To deal with our shame, this is key, by ourselves. As the domains of the mind are disconnected from each other, we turn away, we get quiet, we change the subject, and in doing that, we disconnect from others in a desperate attempt to escape that feeling. What we don't realize is that in hiding our emotions, turning away from others, in our neural networks, we neurologically reinforce the very shame that we're trying to escape. And then with disintegration of mind and relationships comes a felt sense of stasis, of being stuck. Our mind is incapable of moving forward in creative movement. And we're frozen in this powerful emotion. And this is the end of shame. This is the end goal of shame. That we have no forward creative moment. It's an undoing of the creative intention in creation. Shame impulsively drives us to turn away from this very thing that can heal it. Every time we let that happen, we reinforce shame networks in our mind, and we make it that much more likely that the whole cycle is repeated in the future, stifling our joy and co-creativity with God and others. Shame also has a spreading effect. Though our experience of shame seems to emerge from within ourselves and our own minds, we never experience it apart from an initial encounter with someone else that activates the response. And then when it is inside of us, it spills out in condescension. So although shame first presents itself without words at a lower brain level, eventually we try to make sense of it. And one word for describing what we feel could be accused or contempt. And there's research on marriage that claims one of the most powerful predictors of the likelihood that a marriage will not survive is the presence of contempt displayed by one partner towards another. One of the natural responses we have to shame is to judge others, which is just another form of pushing people away. So we hide and push and judge and evoke shame in others, so our shame is contagious. Evil wields shame as a biological weapon of mass destruction. But we really need to think small as well. There's a lot of examples, and we can all think of examples of really hard things that have happened in our lives, maybe, that could lead to shame patterns. But it's so important, and one of the things that I hope we gather from this class is that we really need to be used to and practice thinking smaller. We might think we had a pretty good childhood. I feel like I did. And so some of this might, and some of the stories from the book might feel like they don't quite apply to us, but shame does not always show up in the most obvious ways. Often it shows up in 1,000 tiny cuts that end up making that dense connection. So in the book, there's a story of Ethan, which is a man who came to Dr. Thompson for counseling. He came from a really good Christian home, but he was struggling deeply with self-doubt and depression. In the course of meeting with Ethan, he found out that his father had a seamlessly harmless habit of occasionally showing impatience with Ethan's mistakes, and it always caught him off guard. Every once in a while, there'd be this sarcastic or condescending tone towards his words, or with his words. And his father rarely ever apologized for it. And even though his dad never said any mean words, every time he heard his father sigh out of impatience, he'd feel the weight of just not being fast enough, or smart enough, or experienced enough. And eventually, Ethan would grow up with feeling uneasy and self-critical anytime he was confronted with taking risk in his job or relationships. Another thing shame is, it's this herald of abandonment, right? It's letting us know that we might be alone. We might, at some point soon, or maybe right now, we might be alone. And while the mind flourishes with relationships of attuned and intentional connection, we experience no greater distress than when we experience total abandonment. And with shame, we don't simply sense that something's wrong with us. We sense that we're alone to deal with what's wrong with us. It's a sense that if I let anyone really see what's wrong with me, they won't want anything to do with me. And in this, as shame signals this abandonment, we try to escape the feeling by seeking isolation. One of my favorite quotes from the book is that paradoxically, shame is a leveraging affect that anticipates abandonment while simultaneously initiating a movement away. And like Ethan's story, abandonment doesn't always happen to us in obvious ways. Another story that is mentioned in the book is a woman named Miriam. And she was acutely depressed. She had come with her depression, and in the course of talking with Dr. Thompson, he asked, as he always does, about family life and work life. Currently, she had a boss who rarely ever interacted with her except to occasionally critique her work. And her answer to this was to just perform and work harder. And in asking a little bit more about her family, when she described her dad and her dad's, the impression she got from her dad and how her dad showed her love, she went on and on about the things that he did, the way he performed, but never actually mentioned any actual words he used to express his affection or interest in her. And her dad always offered advice, but only after she initiated and asked for it. And so her natural response eventually became she learned to be a performer like him. She learned to perform in order to feel adequate. And as she grew up, she developed habits that consistently tied her sense of adequacy to her performance. And she did really well with this until she had a supervisor who was unresponsive to her performance and critical of her performance. And it caused a spiral into depression. That brings us to the end of how the mind works and how shame works in the mind. We talked a little bit about the shearing effect of shame. We talked a little bit about the disintegrating effect, and we talked about the spreading effect, and how shame is the harbinger of abandonment. I'm going to open it up here in a second for questions. If you have any of those written down, I know we plowed through. That was 48 minutes or 45 minutes straight. If you would unmute everybody, Joel, while I grab something to type with. Where is... Let me grab my document here. Okay. Yeah, and if there's questions too, I was going to say, if there's questions you'd rather ask me later or one-on-one, we can do that at some point later too. Just email me. I'll give you my email address here. But right now, I'll go ahead and open it up for questions if you have any. If you need a minute to think first, that's great. But are there any questions or thoughts?
And if you want to have an anonymous question, you can send it to me or Daniel only in the chat, and then one of us will read it back for the group.
Yeah.
Daniel, one of the things that I've noticed in my own life is how Satan attaches a message to shame. So I can remember when I was probably 6, and this little boy down the street and I were friends in the neighborhood. And he said to me one day, "Let's fight."
Mm.
Not because we were angry. We're just two boys, two pups, want to go at it. So we put our dukes up and we're dancing around. Neither of us is landing a punch. Nobody's getting hurt. And he came at me and I stepped back and I tripped and I fell on the ground. And I felt shame. And then it got accentuated because as he came to me, I had this thought. I saw a cowboy movie. When the Indian came at the cowboy, he put his foot up and flipped the guy over his head. And I thought, that's what I'll do. And I put my foot up and the guy grabbed my foot. And I felt greater shame. And then the message came, you can't fight. And by the way, I've seen in my life, I can tell you 4 other events in my life where that message was placed with that shame. And that's what Satan is after, is to go. I learned this from Eldridge. Satan doesn't attack us in our weaknesses. He attacks us in our strength. Because if he can wipe out your strength, then you'll be no good to anyone.
Yeah. Yeah, and from a development perspective, one of the key features of shame is when it shows up in that shearing moment where there's this anticipation of positive outcome. You've seen this movie. Put your foot up, boom, I win. And it's in that moment it's a surprise. And that's where we're interrupted. And often we have this deep sense of things like, I can't fight. But it takes a long time to finally realize that's the words that you were feeling.
Right.
And absolutely, this is a weapon that shame or that evil wields. Right. Shame is a harbinger of abandonment, but shame wields that. And we're going to get into then how that affects our narratives. And we'll get into some more stories like yours. Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Does the book get into like the physical manifestations? You mentioned blushing, but I'm wondering if it talks about other things that we can pick up. My counselor has taught me to identify, try to identify when I'm feeling shamed through bodily reactions, physical reactions. And I'm now like trying to translate that, for my boys in order to try and interrupt the shame cycle that we get into without even knowing. And, but they're, so I'm saying, well, do you feel hot all over? Or do you feel, does your stomach feel tight or whatever? And I'm having a hard time pulling out of them that physical piece. Yeah. And I found it really useful. So trying to find other ways to get them to stop and notice.
Yeah, that is really, for me, one of the most, that's one thing that I'm so drawn to when it comes to neurobiology is the connection of things that feel impossible to the body, because it actually does offer this avenue, this way, because our minds are disintegrated in those moments. But our bodies are still very much we can still very much be aware of what's happening in our bodies. And that can give us the ability to step back. So when we experience shame in severe cases, we will just feel totally frozen and unable to remember, what am I supposed to do right now? What do I think? And I think, and this is a pretty common kind of like strategy, but one of the strategies that the book kind of mentions in passing over and over is stepping back. So stopping, not running, not hiding, taking a breath. And what this looks like in a relationship is when you start to feel heavy amounts of frustration, or if you feel like your emotions are just high, to have the ability just in that moment to sense in my body, oh gosh, I'm frustrated, and stop and say, I need to take a few breaths, and then can we come back to this conversation, is huge. But I think everyone's reactions, you might notice in that particular, depending on how severe it is, everyone might notice different reactions, but the common ones are just this heaviness in chest and an inability to think clearly. That's like, for me, one of the biggest ones. You know, even throughout this class, I know these things, I've gone over this thing 100 times, and I'm like having trouble getting the words out. I know that there's just a little bit of nerves, like cutting off some things in my prefrontal cortex, and I know that's happening. So like when I start to slur my words, or when I start to, so when you think of physical manifestations, don't only think about how your body feels, like my palms are sweating, my legs are shaking. Also think about your actions. Like when you often will do the same kinds of things when we're feeling shame. Crossing your arms is a big common one. You're protecting if there's a protective movement. Or there might be something that you just picked up from your parents or picked up from somebody else that is just happening, you don't even realize. If you start counting these things when you don't feel severe cases of shame, so in the less severe case, then you will be more able when it really hits to recognize that. So we really can't wait until those really hard moments. We just have to start thinking about the things that we do in these small moments. But heaviness in the chest is one you talked about. Sweats, looking down, if you notice yourself looking down or look away, or just a sense that like I just want to be gone right now. I just want to like turn off my screen right now. I don't. People often experience this when they're crying in front of people and they're like, gosh, I'm sorry. And they say, I'm sorry. You know, like, what is that? They shouldn't feel bad for saying I'm sorry. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm saying is that's pointing to something that you're wanting to. I wish I wasn't crying. I wish I could hide this part of me right now. So
I'm sorry, I'm crying.
Oh, I'm sorry. And I actually, it says Deborah's Peas. That's all I could see. I don't know what your name is.
Deborah Pease.
Oh, Deborah. Gotcha. Sorry.
My name's Deborah. Oh, is it spelled wrong?
It is. I was like, is that a real person? Joel, keep a watch for that one.
Yeah, that's a real person. I spelled my name wrong.
Oh, no worries. No worries. Deborah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, when we sense that, like I shouldn't be crying right now, or I shouldn't have said this, or I shouldn't, like, we need to really pay attention in those moments and think, well, why? And work backwards. And we're going to do more of that, or kind of see how that's done more in the next few classes too.
Yeah, Daniel, I have a question. This is Mark.
Hey, Mark.
In the idea about neuroplasticity, you know, that's a thing that's been shown to be true, that the connections get reinforced and then can be triggered more easily. Does that vary with age? Is it more so in little kids, less so in adults, or more so? Because I know some people that get more and more emotional over time, and it takes almost nothing. And it seems like it can progress to be permanent in that way, but it never seems to undo.
Right. Yeah, great question. Yeah, and the younger that we are, so especially in infancy, at different stages of our life, in particular when we're learning language and things like that, our brains are developing and growing like crazy. And most of the energy we consume through food is being directed to our brain, which is why, you know, when you think, it's just kind of a weird way to think about it. When you think about a baby, right, their head is kind of disproportional. If you think about an adult's body, it's a lot smaller, but so much is going to that brain. But yeah, much more malleable still when we're children. But the hope is, or not the hope, sorry, the evidence points to it's never too late for neural networks to be changed or pruned. Now, there are certain diseases and things that can make it nearly impossible. And as we age, it is more difficult. And in particular, those neural networks, depending on how much they've been reinforced, they are more and more and more difficult to prune. Or really, it's not so much pruning as it is eclipsing with new neural networks. For example, there are different habits that I've had in the past that I don't have anymore. I still feel the urge to do those things, but I have a greater urge. Like when I get into a good habit of working out, I still very much have the urge to still sleep in, or to, you know, just sit, or just go on YouTube or something. But there's this greater urge that's been created, so this new neural network that can eclipse those things. But yeah, long story short, yes, it is more difficult as we age, but not impossible, according to what I've read in these books. Yeah, it's interesting that often happens through the body too. There are people even with, like I think of Parkinson's and some other things, and there are various therapies that go through the body to develop things in the brain. Like boxing classes are really successful treatments for things like Parkinson's, and increased coordination and stuff like this, even with a disease that's literally tearing their minds apart.
Question about why we have conscious memories of things in our childhood as opposed to the unconscious memories. How would you describe, why is it we remember certain things that we don't others?
So there are a few different levels to that question. There's a difference between implicit and explicit memories, and then there's a difference between conscious and unconscious memories. And when we think of memory, we typically think of images, or like when we think of a memory, like, oh, I have this memory when I was a kid and this happened. But memory is also deeply, like everything else in the mind, emotional, because that's the energy around which the brain organizes itself. So I don't remember a whole lot of things when I was 1 year old. I do have a few memories when I was 2, believe it or not, but not a whole lot. But my body remembers everything. So emotionally, I could have experienced a lot of things, and my body remembers those things. But because of the development of the mind, primarily when we're kids, we're operating straight out of the right part of our brain. Left side is still developing, and long-term memory is still developing. So it's literally because those networks still have to be built and taught to be built, that the images and actual memories aren't there. But the right side of the brain was there the whole time. The right side of the brain remembers everything. So that's a little bit, and there are other parts of the brain as well, but that's working along with some of the more primal parts of our brain. Our body will remember. So there are things we don't even realize we remember from when we're a baby. And that's also why, like, it can be a little frightening, you know, like we think of, oh, she's a baby, she'll never remember. Well, like, she won't actually remember the images and words and this day, but her body will absolutely remember what today felt like. So. We maybe have time for one more. We're already a little bit late. If you need to drop off, no worries. But if you have one more question, I want to give you a chance.
I don't have a question, but I just thought that statement that shame is the primary tool out of which emerges everything we call sin. Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that's true?
Yeah, I struggled with that at first, honestly, because I was like, oh, come on. I don't know if I thought shame was overdone or what. Before I read this book, I was like, really? Like, all right, you know, because different sermons in my life, I've heard, well, selfishness is the thing, or idolatry is the source. I'm like, well, you know, but from the perspective of neuroscience, shame absolutely precedes these things.
Yeah.
And it gets really exciting. It gets really exciting when we talk next week about the biblical narrative and how that fits in. It's my favorite part.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that it's shame's whole design too is for us not to know that it's there.
Yes.
That it is the primary thing our sin
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. And in my life, I primarily experienced that by sort of like justifying my self-talk. Like, oh, that's not that bad to tell myself. You know, really all I said was this. That's not really shame. And then I think of, you know, the stereotypical shrink, like, what are you ashamed of? And like, I tell myself, I'm not really ashamed. Like, that's not really shame. Yeah, there are sorts of, I have a really good book called I Told Me So. Highly recommend. Short book, fascinating book. I Told Me So by, I forget who, but you'll be able to find it. If you can't, email me. I'll put my email, by the way, right now in the chat, daniel@springsic.org, if you want to grab anything from me. I think we should probably wrap up there. Thank you, everybody. How many do we have eventually? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. About 12.
Well, there's 2 here.
Well, hello, two Deborahs.
No, 1 Deborah, 1 Renee.
Oh, hi, Deborah and Renee. Thank you for your visible applause. I appreciate that.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, if any of you want to talk in between classes, after classes, at any point, reach out. And if not, I'll see you next week.
Want to put the camera on?
Good night.
Bye.
Farewell, friends. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, Daniel.